Welcome back to the CSP Elite Baseball Development Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Cressey, and this is episode 165. I'm flying solo for today's episode, but I think it's actually a really important one that'll have a lot of reach to everybody in the baseball community. Going to be talking about velocity and how it has some really far-reaching downstream effects beyond just how it's impacted the way the game is played. I think it has some huge implications in terms of the injury rates that we're seeing, not just in pitchers and not just across Major League Baseball, but at all different levels and in our position players as well. So this is a really important consideration that we all need to be mindful of as the game evolves. And in turn, we try to create better systems to keep players healthy while they're performing at higher levels than ever before. So hopefully you enjoy it. Definitely spread the word if you do enjoy it, because I think these are bits of information that are really important for everyone in the baseball development community, as well as the folks in the sports medicine community that are trying to keep people healthy. Overuse injuries have emerged as one of the biggest threats to players at every level of competition. As an example, at the professional level, ulnar collateral ligament injuries at the elbow alone sideline pitchers for an average of over 17 months. That's a ton of lost development and a threat to lengthy careers. Just as concerningly, though, for youth players, overuse is the predominant mechanism of injury. So what can be done? Obviously, we need to train athletes to be prepared for all the stresses the game throws at them. However, the other side of the equation, recovery, often doesn't get the attention it deserves. Healthy, recovered arms mean you can stay in the game and give your best on the field, and that's where Mark Pro comes in. Mark Pro is a cutting-edge recovery tool that provides all the benefits of active recovery, but without the extra effort, muscular fatigue, or stress to tendons and joints. Players can use Mark Pro as long as needed for exceptional recovery between training sessions or after games. We'll often send Mark Pro units back with athletes to their hotels or even have them use them on team flights. Both easy to use and portable, Mark Pro is a powerful tool that allows recovery anywhere, anytime. Use it while relaxing at home, on the road, or during tournaments. On a personal note, I was originally a naysayer when it came to Mark Pro. However, longtime Cressey sports performance athlete Corey Kluber turned me onto it. He adopted Mark Pro into his post-pitching recovery approach, and it was an integral part of him going out and throwing 200 innings year after year. This led me to experiment with it myself and with more of our athletes, and the feedback was consistently outstanding. Now, just a few years later, you'll see it in every major league organization as part of the routines of some of the most accomplished baseball players on the planet. If you're looking for the same results enjoyed by these athletes, visit markpro.com and use the coupon code Cressey at checkout for an exclusive discount. Again, that's markpro.com, markpro.com, and use the coupon code Cressey, Cressey, at checkout for an exclusive discount. Okay, we are going to kick things off, and velocity is sexy. Everyone gets excited about it, so we're going to talk about it today, but we're not going to talk about it in the context of how do we develop more velocity. This might be the first podcast that doesn't get too caught up in that. Instead, we're going to talk about actually appreciating the far-reaching downstream effects of velocity. So first off, let's consider the way that MLB has measured average fastball velocity. It has changed over the course of time. Originally, we're actually measuring it at about 50 feet, and then they transitioned to measuring out of a pitcher's hand. So there were some kind of apples and oranges comparisons that were taking place. MLB did do a good job to recalibrate them, so we're at least actually comparing apples and apples here. And so if you really look at how fastball velocity has changed over the course of time, Fangraphs is a great website for actually making these comparisons. In 2002, average four-seam fastball velocity was 89.0. In 2022, it was 93.6. So we've seen a 4.6 mile per hour increase in average fastball velocity. And interestingly, the median fastball velocity is actually a tick higher as well. You can probably attribute that to starting pitchers going a little bit shorter in outings, relief pitchers being more heavily utilized in one inning stints and really selling out for velocity. So the median velocity is actually higher than the mean. What's also interesting about these numbers is the usage went from 64.4% in 2002 down to 49.1% in 2022. So we all know that harder fastballs generally work better. Even though that's the case, they're being used 15% less. And fastball usage has really gone down just about every year, dating back all the way back to that point in 2002. It's a little bit variable, but for all intents and purposes, fastball velocity has gone up while usage has gone down. So hitters are also getting better at hitting heaters, and that'll have some implications for what we're going to talk about earlier. But what I think we can all agree on based on those numbers is that it's virtually impossible to compare injuries now to the early 1990s. When we hear people on broadcast, when a player gets hurt, you always hear, well, back in my day, we never pulled obliques, and, we never tore UCLs or anything like that. And there's a lot of reasons for that. There's also diagnostic changes that make UCL injuries easier to diagnose now than they ever were before. But what we have to appreciate is the harder that athletes throw, the more forces they're encountered, and the more downstream effects that really we need to take into account. But first, let's talk about the direct effects of velocity on the pitcher in question. And we're going to talk about elbows specifically, but all of these messages can really be extrapolated out to shoulders, to necks. If we're talking about thoracic outlet, we're seeing more finger issues, things like that. So there was actually a really good study that came out in 1996. It was Glenn Fleissig and Rafael Escamilla. It was called Biomechanics of the Elbow in the Throwing Athlete. And this was a real landmark study that just looked at forces on the elbow during the throwing motion. And just so you know, valgus stress, so imagine trying to take this hinge joint that is your elbow, but instead bending it on the inside, creating this gapping on the inside of the elbow where your ligament is. That valgus stress is what creates UCL injuries. It also creates, other injuries that are related to medial tensile forces, meaning things like ulnar neuritis, flexor strains, medial epicondyle stress fractures, if we're talking about younger players. That's the injury mechanism for ligaments. And to some degree, the ulnar collateral ligament is also a weak resistor to elbow hyperextension. So you will see some athletes that blow out their elbow at ball release. We also know if a ligament isn't doing its job and that valgus stress is really high, you can also get lateral compressive stuff. So more bony issues on the outside of the joint. We tend to see this a lot in like little league elbow, younger kids. But in that study, they actually looked and they found that the UCL, the ulnar collateral ligament, takes on about 54% of that valgus stress. And they quantified that out as 35 Newton meters of force on each pitch. So varus torque creates valgus stress. And what's interesting is they've also done studies of cadavers where they basically take away all the structures, where they just have this ligament connecting bone to bone. And they find that UCLs actually fail at 32 Newton meters of force. So that's pretty eye-opening in the sense that if you just take a ligament by itself, you can rupture it at 32 Newton meters. But according to this model, about 35 Newton meters of force each pitch is put on that UCL. So the question then becomes, why don't we rupture a ligament on every single throw? And it really comes back to there's a huge importance of soft tissue structures and optimal mechanics. The soft tissue structures, the flexor muscles that really cross the elbow, the pronator teres, those things attach at the same point as that UCL, and they create some basically force that can actually offset some of the stuff that goes on that ligament. And also we know that there are certain positions in the delivery that might minimize our stress on the ligament. So optimal mechanics can really play into this as well. So obviously this conceptually makes sense that we want to find ways to take stress off of a ligament, but we have to appreciate also that 64 Newton meters of valgus force in the elbow during layback is highly variable, right? That's a big difference across populations. Not everybody throws the same amount of stress on their elbow. So what's really fascinating, there's a 2009 Journal of Athletic Training article. It was fastball velocity and elbow varus torque in professional baseball pitchers. And one of the things that they observed was that across subjects was hard to compare it. So pitcher A compared to pitcher B would be wildly different. One guy's 92 mile per hour fastball would have entirely different varus torque / valgus stress than the other guys, but within subjects is easier to compare. So if we looked at a pitcher and said 92 miles per hour versus 95 miles per hour, we actually saw an increase in varus torque. So they have this model that suggested that for every 1 meter per second increase in ball velocity, varus torque increased by 0.092% of body weight times height. So for the average pitcher in their study, it would equate to a 1.62 Newton meter increase in varus torque for every 1 meter per second increase in ball velocity. So we don't normally talk in meters per second. And so what we actually look at is every 2.24 mile per hour increase bumps up stress in varus torque about 1.62 newton meters. And we talked about, about 35 newton meters of force being on the ligament in that study previously, probably with a lower velocity group. So we're seeing some variability of maybe it's 1/30th would kind of be the average on about a 2.24 mile per hour increase. So what are the implications for this? Well, first, a lot of pitchers throw more than 3,000 pitches per season, and that's just a cumulative load. So talking about this concept of acute versus chronic load is really important. And we know that pitchers also may be able to reduce their elbow injury risk by varying the velocity at which they throw each pitch, right? So some guys have a lot of variance for both the good and the bad. You look at guys like Greinke and Verlander and Scherzer who have traditionally been able to tailor their velocity higher in big spots and lower when they're just kind of coasting when there's nobody on base in lower stress outings. So certainly that's a hallmark of long-term durable pros. But we're also going to see pitchers who just struggle to vary their varus torque, ones that always have high stress. Those are probably better fits for going to the bullpen because they're not going to handle the crazy amount of load. They're always going to add stress when they throw harder. But what we need to also be mindful of is that there's probably implications for adjusting velocity of their game and moving higher risk pitchers to the bullpen to manage total workload. I don't think anybody would agree with that. But I think it also speaks to is the most vulnerable player might actually be the athlete who gained a ton of velocity in a short amount of time, or someone that went to the bullpen and saw his velocity spike. So when we see someone who goes from 91 to 96 in a year, that's a huge red flag. Someone that's got to work hard to gradually, build up, the soft tissue restraints at the elbow to protect that ligament. So the big picture is that it is not a perfect, this amount of velocity increase causes this much injury risk in this scenario. But we do know that big picture, as average fastball velocity has gone up, Tommy John surgeries in Major League Baseball have risen relatively linearly alongside it. So Dr. Fleissig is a good friend. He was kind enough to send me a graphic that he's used in some of his presentations that demonstrated that UCL surgeries in professional baseball across all levels, so Major League plus minor league, went from about 25 per year, so less than one per organization in 2008, when the average fastball velocity of Major League starting pitchers in innings 1 through 3 was 91.2. And now it's just under 300 in 2022, when that velocity, innings 1 through 3, was 93.8. So you do the math, and we're looking at about 10 or more UCL surgeries in every professional organization on average. And it's not hard to extrapolate because 2023 injury numbers at the big league level are up relative to previous years. And so we really have to be mindful of the fact that we are seeing this linear change as fastball velocity goes up, UCL injuries are going up. And we know that there are various studies. Maximum throwing velocity has been identified as a risk factor for ligamentous injuries. And it's not surprising to say that because fastballs have the greatest mean torque at the elbow compared to off-speed pitches. So DeFroda in 2016, the Orthopedic Journal of Sports Medicine had an article, Risk Stratification for UCL Injury in Major League Pitchers. They looked at 23 pitchers and they found that pitchers with the greatest fastball velocity went on to tear and undergo subsequent reconstruction. Meanwhile, they've had earlier studies that haven't shown any difference in velocity between pitchers pre-injury compared with the controls that weren't injured. So on assessing pitchers with UCL tears compared with ones that didn't, they do see a trend that pitchers who had UCL tears threw higher velocity fastballs. They found that the UCL tear group was a 91.7 mile per hour plus or minus a 2.4 mile per hour standard deviation versus the ones that didn't tear were 91.0 plus or minus 2.5. So there was a 0.7 mile per hour difference in that group. Keep in mind, that was back in 2016. I think what you're going to see is you're going to see a dramatic difference on the higher side now compared to them just because the numbers have surged forward. Really with the big picture, the similar velocity between guys who tore and those who didn't really in 2007 to 2010. But as time has gone on, and in this particular study, 2011, 2014, that velocity gap is widened. And I think we're seeing that more now in Major League Baseball than ever before because you see a larger velocity gap. There are pitchers that are still throwing 86 to 88, and we have athletes that are throwing up to 106 miles per hour. So the larger the gap, the greater the incidence. One interesting thing I also saw in this particular study were the early tears. So they define that as players who ruptured in April through June, averaged 92 miles per hour, and late tears, July to September, averaged 91.6. They found that early tearers had 1.8 years of experience in the major leagues and were on average 24.6 years old, compared to 5.9 years of experience and 28.7 years old in the late teens. So what this tells us is that high risk young idiots who come out throwing too hard in spring training and early in the season are a significant risk factor. So guys who throw hard early in the season before they're really built up for it are super concerning. And then the last point that they made, and again, this was a 2016 study that may not reflect how high the velocity really was. Recurrent tears, so people who tore more than once did throw harder. Compared to that 91.7 mile per hour, the recurrent tears averaged 92.4. So an additional 0.7, not surprisingly, supports the notion that throwing harder increases your likelihood of rupturing your UCL. Building on that, these results were supported in American Journal of Sports Medicine 2016 article from Chalmers et al. Fastball pitch velocity helps predict ulnar collateral ligament reconstruction in major league pitchers. They looked at 1,327 studies, of whom 309, so 26.8%, had a UCL reconstruction. And they found that peak pitch velocity was significantly higher among injuries before their injury compared to the controls. It was 93.3 compared to 92.2 in the healthy guys. What was interesting is that they found that peak pitch velocity was the primary independent predictor of whether a pitcher underwent a reconstruction. And they also found that mean velocity, so average velocity and body mass index, how much they weigh and their age, were also secondary predictors. What was really fascinating about this model, that kind of supports something I talked about earlier, they found that it only explained about 7% of the variance in whether or not athletes had Tommy John surgery. So really what that speaks to is that there are probably a collection of players in this group who, ruptured even though we wouldn't have expected to them. Maybe their numbers were really, really low on the velocity side of things, and they were just folks who had high varus torque at a lower velocity. And then likewise, we probably saw some really hard throwers in this group that had efficient mechanics who were able to for whatever reason, keep varus torque lower. So that's something for the biomechanics lab that we really need to scrutinize. How do we identify the things that keep pitchers healthier from a mechanical standpoint? And then last but not least, on the study side of things, Manzi et al. In arthroscopy in 2023, increased pitch velocity is associated with throwing arm kinetics, injury risk, and ulnar collateral ligament reconstruction in adolescent, college, and professional baseball pitchers, a qualitative systematic review. And I think this was just a really good study to consider, A, because it's 2023, so it's more, up to date. But B, just as importantly, it included high school, college, and professional pitchers. So it saw just a larger gap of players. And I think we need to consider that because so many young kids are getting hurt nowadays. They found that elbow distraction force was positively associated with ball velocity, both in the high school and professional side of things. They found a strong association between pitch velocity and varus torque and elbow distraction force in pro pitchers. They found that fastball velocity was positively associated with a history of throwing arm injury in non-adult pitchers. So younger players who had high velocity were more likely to have been hurt. And really, injured pitcher had faster velocity before their injury compared with uninjured controlled. So it wasn't one of those, hey, let's have guys come in the lab, throw hard, and then we'll follow them for a little bit. But it was really more of something where they looked back at, it was a systematic review, and they found that the players who had ruptured in the past were the hardest throwers. This obviously creates some challenges where sometimes the really good players are the ones that are more likely to get overused and all that. But it does speak to this big picture idea that we know that throwing hard is, generally speaking, more forces, and more force, it creates a higher injury risk. Now, with all that said, there are absolutely outliers who can throw hard with lower risk, but it certainly is not the norm. It would actually be the exception. And those are the white whales that maybe your Nolan Ryans of the world that can throw a crazy amount of time and not wind up with ligament issues until the very end of a career. Now, keep in mind that we just use elbows as our example in this discussion, but it's easy to extend these things to shoulders and certainly to other aspects of the body. I'm sure we see more, forces across in oblique and hard throwers as well. But rather than spend too much time talking about those things, what I actually want to delve into a little bit more now is the downstream effects of how the game has adjusted to increased velocity. That can relate to hitter and catcher interactions. It can lead to how hitters have had to adjust their training. And it also leads to ways that the game has had to be adjusted. So rule changes because velocity has taken over and it's so hard to get on base. First, as pitchers have sold out for velocity, that may be more up-tempo deliveries, not finishing, maybe in positions that are as advantageous for fielding their position. We've definitely seen an increase in hit by pitches. They've increased dramatically from 1980, but there has been a resurgence when they were appearing to level off, and this is over the past 10 years or so. I'd encourage you, there's a great Fangraphs article called "The Hit by Pitch Continues to Reach New Heights." Really what happened was hit by pitches seemed to level off in 2020 at about 0.46 per game. I think this year they're at 0.42. They were never really this high consistently. So we are seeing more hitters get hit by pitches. That can be both because pitchers are selling out for velocity and command may suffer, and also hitters just simply have less time to get out of the way. So that's one downstream effect, more hit by pitches for our hitters. Another one that's fascinating, Sports Info Solutions had an article by John Duan that I thought was awesome. And the article is titled Stat of the Week, Pitcher Injuries on Comebackers on the Rise. And they looked at comebacker injuries to pitchers through May 17th. And what's fascinating is 2018 was the highest in recorded history of a significant injury coming on a comebacker where a pitcher is hit by a line drive or a ground ball back at them. And they had 19 in 2018. But for the most part, if you look at 15, 16, all the way down to 2022, it was 11, 8, 9, 19, 12, 5, 6, and 8. This year in 2023 through May 17th, so really just over a month and a half of the season, they had already had 10 pitcher comeback injuries. There have actually been 3 skull fractures in baseball this year alone. So it makes sense. Hitters are hitting the ball harder than ever before. Pitchers are throwing the ball harder than ever before, and in many cases finishing in positions that may not be advantageous for protecting themselves. We are seeing more and more pitchers get injured on line drives and ground balls right back at them. It seems to be, we've already topped 2022, 2021, so this is something that we need to be really mindful. We also have to consider our catchers. There are less hitters that are squaring up baseballs because velocity is so high and the stuff that plays off that velocity is incredible. So we're seeing more mishits. What happens when you have mishits? You get foul tips that mess up catchers' thumbs and toes. They create concussions and thigh bruises. And this is happening at the same time that catcher receiving metrics are really becoming heavily valued. So you're seeing more catchers that are getting closer to the plate to steal strikes. So there's less time to catch pitches, both because the velocity is higher and the catcher is actually closer to the pitcher. And we're seeing a higher likelihood of catcher interference calls because catchers are a little bit closer. So we just have a more vulnerable catcher overall. That's more thumbs, that's more wrists, that's more skulls, that's more thighs, that's more toes, all these different things. But I think we have to appreciate also that the hitters have had to adjust their training. They're hitting higher velocity off machines in the cages than ever before. That it can increase the likelihood of mishits and guys getting thumbs that are blown up. This is where kind of the foam ball revolution has started, where guys can get in more reps on high velo without destroying a thumb or a wrist. But building on that, we're also seeing far more random practice than ever before. So for those of you who don't understand what that means, random practice versus block practice is just a way to approach motor learning. And I think the best way to describe it is putting. If I wanted to become a good golf putter, I could go out and I could hit the same 6-foot putt over and over and over again, or I could take one at 6, one at 10, one uphill, one downhill, one from 3, one back at 25. And the research has actually showed that random practice, so doing a variety of different things, particularly an element of lack of predictability, is better for long-term motor learning, even if in the short term you struggle more. So what that means in the context of baseball is the era of just seeing, easily grooved, high 60 to low 70 mile per hour batting practice from up close, where you're always going to be successful. You're rarely going to swing and miss. You're not going to see spin. You're not going to see changes of speeds. That was always a very blocked practice. Now we're seeing more and more teams that are utilizing random practice. Guys are swinging and missing in the cages. They're seeing high velo. They're seeing cutters. They're seeing breaking balls. They're seeing changeups in the cages. There's an article. It was under the kind of the phrase practice dirty, play clean that highlight the San Francisco Giants using this, as they had a lot of success in 2021, and it's certainly something that's taking over in a lot of levels of baseball, and there's definitely merit to it. The one tricky part about random practice is that it's very easy to overdo it because it is inherently hard on players. And now you have companies like Traject and iPitch that have entered higher levels of baseball. These things can actually simulate pitch metrics that players would face in the starting pitcher, relief pitchers in the game that follows. So players at the highest level can prepare pregame with what they're going to see in the actual game. It's a 2400 RPM four seam with 4 inches of horizontal movement. This is a slider that has 16 inches of sweep or whatever it is. So players can simulate full velocity and stuff at bats against pitchers. And what that does is it quickly drives up their game rep workload. So a player, in the major leagues, it'd be a big deal to get 600 plate appearances in a season. Now we're seeing guys that can go out and get 2,000 if they really want to, just by spending time in the cages. So volume can really surge without people knowing it. It's particularly challenging when you have very progressive coaches that love to challenge players and get better faster. So that means getting fooled much more often in training. And you think about where the adjustability in a swing comes from in a pitch. It comes in obliques and it comes in wrists. So first off, in the context of an oblique strain, what will happen in a right-handed hitter is their pelvis will rotate counterclockwise towards the pitcher while their torso remains back clockwise, which allows them to keep their hands back and ultimately give them adjustability to keep the barrel in the zone for longer. So what will happen is the pelvis will go one way and the torso will try to lag behind. And when you try to help the torso lag later, when they get fooled with something off speed after gearing up for high velocity, you can see an oblique injury on that front side. Now, wrists are very, very similar. They're just a little bit further down the chain. What can actually happen is you get radial deviation. So the wrist will actually gap on the inside as people try to hold their hands back and take a ball the opposite way. So radial deviation against load is definitely something that we have to keep in mind. So there is an interesting trend taking place in baseball across the injury spectrum. We're seeing a dramatic increase in both oblique and wrist injuries in baseball this year. So I'm actually recording this during the All-Star break. As an example, if you look at wrist injuries for 17, 18, 19, 21, and 22, so the last 5 full seasons, they've averaged 20 per year. This year in Major League Baseball, we've already seen 15 IL placements for wrist injuries. And there's some other factors downstream that'll relate to this, but obliques, over those same 5 seasons, we saw 44.4 on average per year. We've already seen 37 as of the All-Star break in 2023. My expectation is also that we're seeing a jump in the number of batter shoulder injuries. So that's a lead shoulder, kind of a horizontal adduction injury. So imagine reaching across your chest. It's a posterior labral tear in the front shoulder where basically athletes are trying to preserve their bat in the zone longer when they get fooled. They're hitting balls late. But it's really hard to separate this injury out because position player data is obviously lumped with pitchers' shoulders and all-cause injuries like dives and slides and collisions and throwing things in position players. So I think that's more speculative, but it is completely non-debatable that oblique and wrist injuries are up as more and more random practice has taken place secondary to the high velocity era. And speaking of which, in the context of this era discussion, did you notice that we've had rule changes that have taken place in baseball because pitchers have been so nasty for so long now? And Major League Baseball, rightfully so, wanted more action and more runs, so we've gotten a few adjustments. First off, they banned the shift. So infielders now have to go back to covering a greater range. It's awesome for showing off our hyper athletic players and seeing some spectacular things. You're also going to get athletes that are closer to top speed as they try to cover more range. That's where obviously injuries are more likely to occur. Hamstrings as they get stretched closer to top speed and upright sprinting. And you're also going to see more dives that can create shoulder and wrist injuries. Not to mention contusions if you have an ugly belly flop dive or something like that. I don't see that as a huge issue, but it is a consideration. But the second aspect of this, I think, is really more important is we've limited pickoffs and made the bases larger, and that has created a surge in stolen base attempts. That's more guys running fast and diving, and it's more middle infielders who are exposed to injuries related to tags. And this is especially true when you consider that catchers are now throwing to the first base side of the bag more to shorten the distance the ball has to travel. So in the past, it was kind of understood you threw the ball to the bag and tried to put it there. But unfortunately, it can lead middle infielders now directly into collisions as we throw to the first base side. We're also seeing catchers obviously make more max effort throws, not only on steal attempts, but definitely as back pick attempts from catchers have been up across baseball. We've already seen one noteworthy injury at first base on a back pick where, first baseman is kind of left vulnerable trying to make that tag, much more so than you would see at like a third base scenario. It stands to reason that more position players are going to be vulnerable as stolen base attempts go up. And then third, we have a pitch clock now. It does not seem to be capping velocity. Velocity is still up across baseball this year, but you can bet that more pitchers are throwing with more fatigue now, which likely has some implications for both injuries and erratic misses. We know fatigue is the enemy of motor learning, so it's really not a stretch to assume that it's also an enemy to fine motor control in the heat of the moment. So there's all these different places that velocity is impacting the game from an injury standpoint, both directly on the pitchers throwing it and also downstream on the hitters and the catchers and the base runners that are involved in a game with such high velocity. So the obvious next question then becomes, what do we do about it? And I think that's a really hard question to answer. But what I come back to is it always needs to start at the youth levels and in looking at the overall calendar of professional baseball. From a youth sport perspective, one of the things that we have to be mindful of is that players are more broken at young ages than ever before. When we have kids that are throwing 95 at age 16, they're leaving themselves more exposed to these injuries over the long term. The studies that I've cited have obviously shown that, but I think just as important, it's creating a challenge for professional baseball when the players that enter baseball are already broken by the time they arrive there. And we're certainly seeing exponentially higher injury rates in the NCAA ranks, even where the workload is lower than it would be in professional baseball. So as is always the case from an injury prevention standpoint, it starts with grassroots efforts with younger players to integrate appropriate strength and conditioning, arm care interventions, proper management of volume, and reasonable expectations in terms of velocity, in the early years, so that we're not getting these guys too good too young. And I don't think we should ever think about like trying to pull back and say that velocity is the devil and no one's allowed to throw hard, because that's never going to work as a strategy. But I do think we need to draw better guidelines up, and more importantly, have people actually follow the guidelines in place. So one of the ways that we can create some guardrails like that is minimizing scouting events, during times of the year that encourage players to continue to throw when they should be quieted down. You can definitely see scenarios where you don't allow showcases to take place in November, December, January, so that pitchers are actually forced to take some downtime during portions of the year where they would get into trouble with high level competition. I think that's vitally important. On the major league side, the discussion probably starts with looking at the competitive schedule. Does spring training need to be as long? Could the season be shorter? Could there be a scenario where more off days take place during the season? Maybe a mandated off day each week, which seems to have worked well on the minor league side with every Monday off. These are all questions that probably need to be asked big picture across the game, because the players are throwing harder and moving faster than ever before, and the travel and the stress of the game is probably as high as it's ever been. So these are important considerations big picture for the game. Specific to individual scenarios, teams can certainly help their cause by being really good at evaluating workload, actually quantifying it, understanding how not just to manipulate acute and chronic workload and finding players appropriate time for rest, but also in integrating appropriate recovery initiatives, whether that's sleep awareness stuff, actual high quality food, or just understanding when people need time off and the right kind of recovery protocols that they can utilize. So these are all big picture discussions that need to take place. It also speaks to why this is such a challenging problem, because it involves skill development coaches, sports scientists, strength and conditioning coaches, sports medicine staff, mental skills coaches, so many different people. And then, obviously at the younger levels, it's the kid themselves, it's the parents, it's the entire industry that is driven by showcases and travel ball, where there's heavy financial incentives for kids to play more and throw harder. So it's a really, really hard problem that, no one person is ever going to wrap their head around. Instead, it has to be an industry solution to really get to the bottom of why velocity is changing this game so dramatically. biomechanicaly and why it's so much different, both for the better and for the worse than it was, say, 10, 15 years ago. So thanks for listening. I hope you found this beneficial, and I'd really appreciate it if you would share it if you found benefit, because I think these are important messages that we need to distribute across all levels of baseball.